Hi, my name is Thomas Lee. I'm a staff attorney for the Attorney Grievance Committee, and we are part of the Appellate Division, 1st Judicial Department of the State of New York. So we prosecute ethics complaints against attorneys and district attorneys. What we do is when people complain about their lawyers or their ADAs about possibly making ethical misconduct, we investigate the case, and if there is found to be some ethics violation, then we ask the court to sanction the attorney with appropriate penalties such as license suspension or disbarment. And our jurisdiction covers Manhattan and the Bronx. And because most New York attorneys have offices in Manhattan, our jurisdiction covers most New York attorneys. And as a result, we have investigated high-profile attorneys from time to time. For example, Rudy Giuliani, a former New York City mayor, received interim suspension of his New York law license a couple of weeks ago, and that was the result of our office's work. To be a Korean American living in the United States right now is a little bit confusing. Korea is definitely a lot better known to foreigners nowadays than it was when I first immigrated here 23 years ago. When I first immigrated here, people didn't know what Korea was or where it was. People assumed I was Chinese or Japanese because that's all they knew about Far East countries. But nowadays, everything is so well known about Korea. Korean cuisine, Korean pop culture, music, Korean dramas. I mean, my former colleagues, my lawyer colleagues at my old job, knew more about Korean dramas and Korean pop music than I did. That's how well known Korea is here. And I drive a Korean car, I have a Korean cell phone. It's something that is definitely something to be very proud of. But I say that it's confusing to be a Korean American nowadays because how easily we can become targeted for racism in light of the global pandemic, especially. For example, very recently at my own very home, a state inspector for the state of New Jersey, which is where I live, came to inspect my apartment. It was a very big Caucasian male. I asked the person to either remove his shoes or to cover his shoes with plastic bags. And in the 23 years that I've lived in this country, every time I made a request like that, the request was complied with because this is our culture, it's very well known, and this is a way to respect our culture. But this time, this inspector became very irate as soon as I made this request and started raising his voice and started yelling at me, refusing to take off his shoes or to put on plastic bags. And when I tried to reason with him to try to come to a middle ground, he just stormed out. He just stormed off, and he ran downstairs, yelling without even turning back that this will result in a violation for my home and that I'll have to pay a fine. Long story short, I wrote an email to the state agency and explained that this was a blatant example of racism and hatred against the Asians, and that it was very disappointing and very enraging for me to not only go through that personally, but to know that my two very young children who were home at the time witnessed their father getting yelled at for no apparent reason by a racist, and that they had to watch their culture being ridiculed and marginalized. Ultimately, there was no fine, there was no penalty, but this is just one example of what Korean Americans have to go through nowadays in light of the Asian hatred and the racism that has become a lot more rampant in light of the global pandemic. There are two things that I want to say. First is to honor God, because God honors those who honor Him. When we choose to honor God, we are often placed in a position where we have to directly oppose the world and its principles. But because God is good, and because God is omnipotent, and because God is always loving, you are able to overcome any opposition of the world, and God is able to give you a lot more than whatever it is that you may have to sacrifice in order to honor God. For example, personally, when I had just gotten out of college, I found an office job in New York City. I was in my early 20s, and the job required me to lie on the phone many times. And after a few times, I realized that this was not honoring God, because God does not like dishonesty. So after much prayer, I confronted my boss and I told him that I cannot lie anymore because I want to honor God. And to my surprise, he didn't fire me, even though I fully expected him to, for being insubordinate. Instead, he didn't agree with me either, but he told me that he respected me for standing up for what I thought was right, and he treated me with respect until my very last day at the job. And this is an example of how God can honor those who choose to honor Him. Second thing that I want to say is to always be plugged into a healthy Christian community and to find good spiritual mentors. God didn't create any of us to be solitary Christians. We are meant for community. We're meant to spur each other on. We're meant to mentor others and be mentored by others. This is one of the great ways that God has designed us to see His majesty. And so this is very important. And personally, my life when I was plugged into a healthy Christian community and when I had good Christian mentors versus my life when I wasn't plugged into a community like that, or when I didn't have those mentors, it's so vastly different. And the scary part is that when I wasn't plugged into a healthy Christian community and when I didn't have good Christian mentors, I didn't even realize that I was falling spiritually. It only came to my realization a few years later, and I had lost so much time by then. And that's the scary part. And so, as young people, I want to recommend that you always surround yourself with good Christian brothers and sisters, including mentors. And no matter what you're going through, don't give up, but keep going and hold on to God, because there will be light at the end of this tunnel, because God is always good and because God is always loving. Thank you.